The sea was black glass that night, unbroken but for the gray smear of smoke that hung low across the horizon. The SS Atlantic Conveyor moved slow and deliberate through the South Atlantic, her engines steady under the weight of a war she had not been built to fight. Inside the converted cargo hold, helicopters stood lashed in neat rows, blades folded and tied down with steel cable. The air smelled of diesel and salt, the hum of generators echoing up through the decks. It was May 25, 1982, day 43 of the Falklands conflict, and the men aboard knew they were close enough now for enemy radar to see them. She had been a merchant vessel, British-flagged, and built for the simple business of hauling containers across peacetime oceans. But in April, when Argentina seized the Falkland Islands, the Royal Navy had turned to every hull it could find. The Atlantic Conveyor, owned by Cunard and chartered for war, became one of the first civilian ships pressed into military service. Dock workers in Liverpool worked around the clock, cutting open decks, welding in platforms, and bolting down sea harriers and Chinooks where shipping crates had once been. Her captain, Ian North, accepted the orders without protest. He'd spent his life at sea. Now he was taking his ship to war. The crossing south was long and cold. From Ascension Island, the ship joined the task force heading toward the conflict zone. She carried 12 helicopters, Harrier jump jets, spare engines, tents, rations, and nearly every part the Royal Navy's carrier group couldn't do without. Her gray paint was still fresh when she entered the exclusion zone. North ran drills with his crew, merchant sailors now wearing flak jackets over their coveralls, and briefed them on missile alerts. The ship had no defensive weapons of her own. If the Argentines found them, there would be nowhere to hide. In the late afternoon, May 25th, the Atlantic Conveyor steamed east of the Falklands in formation with the aircraft carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. The sea was calm, the wind cold enough to sting. On the horizon, the faint silhouettes of escorts cut slow lines across the waves. The air group on Hermes had launched earlier to intercept a flight of Argentine Super Étendard jets reported heading their way. The men on Conveyor watched the sky, listening to radio chatter that came in bursts of clipped static. 2 Exocet missiles had been fired at the task force. One hit the destroyer HMS Coventry. The second vanished from radar. Minutes later, a lookout on the port side saw the faint glint of something low over the water, a flash of metal skipping the waves. Before the warning could reach the bridge, the Exocet struck the Atlantic Conveyor midships, just above the waterline on her port quarter. The sound was a hammer blow. Fire tore through the hull, splitting open containers and spraying molten insulation. Inside the holds, aviation fuel and lubricants caught instantly. Flames climbed through the ventilation shafts and burst from the open deck where the helicopters stood waiting to fly. Men scrambled for extinguishers, dragging hoses that melted in their hands. The blast had knocked out the fire main. The pumps were gone. Captain North stayed on the bridge, shouting orders through smoke that rolled like fog. The ship's radio operator got a distress call off to Hermes. Conveyor hit. Fire out of control. There was no power to the hydrants, and the heat was growing unbearable. Steel bulkheads began to buckle, releasing the sound of snapping bolts as the decks warped. Within minutes, the containers on deck ignited one by one, each explosion feeding the next. The flames reached the aircraft fuel lines, and the Chinooks burned where they sat. Acrid smoke poured hundreds of feet into the air, thick with plastic and oil. Sailors and soldiers abandoned the fire line and moved aft, covering their faces with torn cloth. Some jumped into the water, others waited for rescue craft from nearby ships. The Atlantic Conveyor, 1,450 tons of steel and cargo, was dying fast. Helicopters from Hermes and Invincible circled overhead, their pilots watching in disbelief as the converted freighter turned into a floating furnace. Lifeboats launched through debris and falling ash. North was last seen on the bridge with his chief engineer, still trying to coordinate the evacuation. When the flames reached the forward stores, a blast ripped through the ship from below decks. By the time the first rescue boats arrived, the bridge was gone. 43 men were rescued from the water and life rafts. 12 were missing, including Captain North. Survivors clung to the rails of the support ships, faces streaked with soot, watching as their home burned down to the waterline. The heat warped the sky. They could hear the occasional dull pop of fuel tanks bursting below. By midnight, the Atlantic Conveyor was a black silhouette against the glow of her own fire. She stayed afloat another day, listing heavily, smoke trailing for miles. Then, on May 28th, she slipped beneath the surface and was gone. The loss went far beyond the ship and her crew. The helicopters aboard her had been meant to ferry troops, supplies, and artillery across the islands. Without them, British forces were forced to march on foot across rough, frozen ground to reach Stanley. Every ration, every shell had to be carried by hand or by small landing craft through surf that swallowed engines whole. Men cursed the loss of the conveyor birds, but few realized how close they'd come to losing the entire fleet. The exocet that struck her had likely been aimed for Hermes. By absorbing the hit, the Atlantic Conveyor had saved hundreds. In the weeks that followed, search ships combed the area for debris. Containers floated up like tombstones, spilling cargo across the sea, tent poles, ration boxes, scorched machinery. The wreck itself came to rest at a depth of more than 12,000 feet, upright on the seabed, her decks still full of helicopters twisted and fused by heat. Divers marked her position but never descended. The depth was too great. The site was declared a war grave. Captain North was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. For the merchant sailors who served under him, the recognition came quietly. Medals for bravery, letters sent to families who had watched the war on television without realizing their fathers and husbands had gone to sea unarmed. The British public learned the name Atlantic Conveyor only after the conflict ended, when photographs of the burning ship ran across the morning papers. In one frame, taken from a Sea King helicopter, the ship is seen at a sharp angle, her deck an open wound of flame while rescue boats scatter below. Years later, survivors would remember the sound more than the heat, the steady hiss of the fire eating through steel, the crack of a container collapsing, the way the ocean glowed beneath them as the ship burned. One engineer said he could still smell the melted paint when he closed his eyes. Another recalled climbing down the port side on a rope, the tar boiling under his boots. None forgot the silence after the last explosion, when the waves closed over the flames and the sea went black again. In 2017, a new container ship bearing the same name was christened Atlantic Conveyor 2, this time for peacetime service. The ceremony was brief. No speeches mentioned the first ship or the men who had gone down with her, but a small plaque was mounted inside the wheelhouse. It read simply, "In memory of those who served and sailed before us." The original Atlantic Conveyor remains on the ocean floor off the Falklands, rusting in the dark, her decks still holding the shapes of the aircraft that never flew. For the men who were there, the war ended the moment she vanished below the surface. The rest of the fleet sailed on. But every time they passed over that stretch of water, someone would step to the rail and look down, knowing that beneath them lay the ship that gave them a chance to live. Thank you for listening to The Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.